First, we're going to reconstruct Husker's argument for emergent dualism. He starts off by giving a definition for emergence, saying when elements of a certain sort are assembled in the right way, something new comes into being. There are several concepts where emergence can occur, such as logical emergence, causal emergence, emergent causal powers, and emergent substances. This last idea of a substance is the key part of the theory of emergent dualism, as Husker points out. The idea of emergent dualism that Husker represents can accommodate for several problems of the philosophical domain, namely the mind-body connection, animal consciousness, biological evolution, and the afterlife. After stating the idea of his favorite view, Husker analyzes the competing theories and comes up with areas of weaknesses for each of them. The first theory that he analyzes is the materialism view, which is the idea that everything is physical and there are no mental states. Problems with that view are free will and determinism. There's consciousness and biological evolution. Only for non-reductive materialists, there's also the problem of downward causation. He goes on giving an account for emergent materialism, which is the idea of a materialistic world that also has emergent causal powers. For this view, there are problems such as scientific coherence, unity of consciousness, and the afterlife. The last view he analyzes is Cartesian dualism, the idea that there are two distinct entities, namely the body and the soul. Husker points out that this theory is very spooky. As Riley's points out, there's a ghost in a body. It also has difficulties accommodating important realities, such as leading scientific theories regarding biological evolution and animal consciousness. It also has a fragmented vision of a person regarding the mind-body relation. All in all, Husker comes up with several problems for all of the competing theories, and things that his idea of emergent dualism gives the best account to our present worldview, and therefore he thinks that his emergent dualism view is the best explanation.
Next, we will discuss three of Husker's most contentious claims. The first I call the best of both worlds claim. It can be phrased this way: emergent dualism does justice to what we know about both science and Christianity. This claim is contentious for those in the scientific and Christian communities who argue that the theory fails to cohere with important commitments of one or both of the realms. For example, some doubt that strong emergence is supportable given current science. Further, some, like Corcoran, argue that the theory fails to provide an adequate account of the resurrection. Others, like Goetz, argue it fails to offer an appropriate vision of God's creative abilities. Resistance of unrestrained assertion of the claim seems warranted, but perhaps there's a better way to think about it. Perhaps emergent dualism is the best of both worlds for people who have particular commitments similar to Husker's, preconditions he admits are necessary to finding the theory plausible. We might agree that it isn't one way of interpreting the data of both realms in a more or less coherent way. Further, one might propose the contentious claim if one anticipates, respects, and responds to objections from both realms. The second claim I call the strong emergence claim. It can be phrased like this: it is both possible and actual that emergent laws, causal powers, and individuals exist. In summary, strong emergence is true. Husker explains that some are reluctant to adopt strong emergence because attributing causal powers to emergent realities is a dramatic and extremely controversial metaphysical claim. In philosopher William Jaworski's words, some think there is good empirical reason to think there are no emergent forces. Rather, it seems that all the forces that exist can be described and explained by physics, and emergent forces cannot be. The words of Husker and Jaworski reveal the controversial nature of the claim. While one can argue for strong emergence, further philosophical argumentation and scientific evidence might benefit those who hold to this claim. For many, this claim is difficult to justify given current arguments. Further, some in the scientific community argue that positing these realities is, one, to unnecessarily complicate metaphysics, and two, to posit realities that fail to cohere with science. This discussion indicates that Husker's strong emergence claim is highly controversial and suggests it might benefit from additional justification. The third claim I term the closer relation claim. Husker asserts that his emergent dualism is superior to traditional dualism because it posits a closer connection between mind and body, and presumably is in a better position in facing traditional mind-body problems. It is not, however, clear that this is the case. In fact, other substance dualists and philosophers might say that given his presentation, Hasker is in roughly the same position as other dualists on these issues. There is a tension between his dualism, that there are two disparate substances, and his emergence, particularly in his explanation of how emergent accounts for a unified person. For him, there is, quote, no seam that marks the division of mind, soul, spirit from bodily existence, end quote. The tension of substances that are both dissimilar and unified indicates that the claim is not immediately obvious. But it is in his failure to explain how the two substances manage to have a seamless connection that makes his assertion truly debatable. He attempts to justify it in his explanation of mind-body dependence relations. First, the mind depends on the body in that it originates from the body. Second, it depends on the body for continuance. Origin doesn't seem to be enough to fully justify the closer relation claim, especially since a whole new substance emerges. So it must be on the basis of continuance that Hasker maintains the claim. However, there is little explanation or justification for the dependence-continuance relation. Because of this, Hasker is in roughly the same position as other substance dualists regarding the mind-body connection. In order to maintain the closer relation claim, Hasker's burden is to provide a more adequate description of his continuance-dependence relation and a clearer explanation of how this dependence makes the theory superior to others in accounting for mental-physical relation.
The objection that we have chosen was Corcoran's The Constitutionalist. There is a real difficulty in the doctrine for resurrection for the emergent dualist. Their critique would go something like this. Given the preconditions of an emergent soul, one would expect the resurrection body God creates to generate its own. In the assumption, God's restoration of a body would lead to the production of a new soul, rather than a body with merely soul-favorable conditions. Corcoran calls this natural thought. Hasker's theory of resurrection would go something like this. A soul is necessary for an enduring personal identity. This means a coherent possibility that the mind could survive the death of the body. Because the mind can survive the death of the body, it can survive resurrection, as long as the resurrection body is precisely tailored to fit the soul in question. Corcoran states on the emergent dualist framework there are only two options for a resurrection body. So it goes into his dilemma. God creates something like a corpse or a husk that infuses the soul into it. The body would not be hospitable to the soul because the soul requires the functional complexity of a human body. This creates an identity issue. The other option would be God creates a functional equivalent of a human body. The body would generate its own unique soul. That differs from the original soul. This creates an identity issue also. In conclusion, because the only options available for the emergent dualist for a resurrection body leads to absurd implications, emergent dualism cannot accommodate a sufficient view for resurrection. So we think there would be two possible responses that Hasker could give. One would be the resurrection is a mysterious thing in nature, and there are a lot of other theories that give tales to the afterlife, yet they're no more or less problematic than any other versions of resurrection because we really just don't know, so that's mysterious. The second would be Corcoran's dilemma, would be illegitimate. And God can and will develop a body that is hospitable to sustain a soul, and God infuses it into the body because he's omnipotent and all-knowing, so he could do such a thing. Perhaps, on the other hand, resurrection bodies are constructed differently, so the issue of emergence is irrelevant. So, in response, Hasker still holds weight and has his emergent dualism still secure.